ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Continuing with our look at some contemporary issues with regards to namaz, and in particular those issues where there are differences of opinions amongst the ulamas, amongst the scholars. Inshallah, in today's dars, in today's lesson, we'll be concentrating on three issues or three important topic areas. The first issue or the first topic which we will be discussing is with regards to Raf'ul Yadayn. The second topic or the second issue is with regards to after you do the Takbir Tahlima and you place your right hand on your left hand, your right palm over your left palm, then where should you place your hand? Should you place your hands below your navel, or should you place your hands above the navel and on the chest? And the third issue or the third masla we'll be looking at is that in tashahhud or in at-tahiyyat, when you read at-tahiyyatu lillahi salawatu and so on, and you reach ashhadu an la ilaha and you raise your index finger. So the masla we'll be looking at is that your index finger, would you keep it still, or would you move it around all the way until you finish your salah, you finish your namaz, or should you just keep it still, keep it pointed all the way until the end? And then inshallah, after we look at the three issues, if we have time, inshallah, we'll have a small question and answer session. Now, the first masla which we are going to look at, in Arabic is called Raf'ul Yadayn, which literally or translates into as the raising of the hand. Now, it is a consensus of all the ulama, all the scholars, all the muhaddithin, all the jurists agree that at the beginning of your namaz, like at Takbir Tahlima, to raise your hand is sunnah. So when you raising, for example, when you say Allahu Akbar, when you beginning your namaz right at the beginning, then to raise your hand is something which is sunnah, something which has been prescribed by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All the ulamas, all the scholars agree, and there are no differences or anything like that. However, when you've started your namaz and you've said the sana, you've said Surah Al-Fatiha, you've read a surah, and then you go into ruku. And similarly, when you say Sami Allahu liman hamida and you come up from the ruku, the question or the issue is that whilst going into the ruku, should you raise your hands and go into the ruku, raise your hands and say Allahu Akbar, go into the ruku? And similarly, when you're saying Sami Allahu liman hamida and coming up from the ruku, should you raise your hands or not? This issue, or in this particular section or that particular issue, there are differences of opinion. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi have said that it is more virtuous and more preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. That when going into ruku, and similarly when saying Sami Allahu liman hamida and when coming up from the ruku, it is more virtuous and more preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn, not to raise your hands and go into ruku, and not to raise your hands when coming up from the ruku. This is the view of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh. Whereas Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayh and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayh are of the view that when you go into ruku, it is sunnah and it is more virtuous to raise your hands and go into ruku. So when you're going into ruku and you say Allahu Akbar, then you should raise your hands and go into the ruku. And similarly, when coming up from the ruku while saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, it is more virtuous and it is more preferable to raise your hands and then come up from the ruku. So that is the issue which we need to look at, and this is where there are the differences of opinion. Now, it should be borne in mind that the differences which I have stated, it is based upon which of the two is the more virtuous. This masla is nothing to do with something which is wajib or something which is non-wajib in namaz. The masla here is based on out of which two which one is the more virtuous and more preferable to do? Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi said that it is more virtuous not to do Raf'ul Yadayn whilst going into the ruku and whilst coming up from the ruku. Whereas Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayhi have said that it is more virtuous and more preferable and it is more closer to sunnah to raise your hands and go into ruku, and similarly when coming up from the ruku to raise your hands. In the respective mazhabs, if you look in the books, they will even say that even in the Shafi mazhab, even in the Hanbali mazhab, they also allow not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. Now even in the Shafi mazhab, if a person doesn't do Raf'ul Yadayn and he goes into ruku, or he doesn't do Raf'ul Yadayn and he comes up from the ruku, then his namaz or his salah would not be considered invalid. There will be no detestability, there will be no karahiyah in his namaz. Similarly, in the Hanafi mazhab, if a person does Raf'ul Yadayn and he goes into ruku, similarly whilst coming up from the ruku he does Raf'ul Yadayn, then again there's no detestability in the namaz. His namaz will not be considered invalid, his namaz will not be considered annulled or broken or anything like that. So from this we can determine that the differences here which we are looking at is something to do which one is more virtuous and which one is more preferable to do. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah says that it's more virtuous not to do Raf'ul Yadayn, whereas Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad and so on have said that it is more virtuous and more preferable to do Raf'ul Yadayn. Now, Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayhi's view can be supported through a hadith which can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim. Now the hadith narrated by Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Umar radhiyallahu anhu, that once he describes the salah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he says that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did the takbir tahrima, meaning at the beginning of the salah when he said Allahu Akbar, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would raise his hand. And then Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Umar radhiyallahu anhu goes on to say that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went into ruku, he raised his hand. And then when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got up from the ruku while saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam again raised his hand. And then after that, i.e. when he went for the sajda, when coming up from the sajda, he did not raise his hand. So this is the hadith used by Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayhi to consolidate their opinion, to support their view, and that is that Raf'ul Yadayn, you should do it at the beginning of the salah, and similarly whilst going for the ruku and whilst coming up from the ruku, you should do Raf'ul Yadayn, and according to them it is more virtuous to do. In the Hanafi mazhab, and this is a point which we need to clear, is that in the Hanafi mazhab we don't say Raf'ul Yadayn is something which is abrogated. That is where many people who are not Hanafis, they accuse the Hanafis or the Hanafi mazhab like there's a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari and you're saying that this is abrogated. We do not say that Raf'ul Yadayn is abrogated. We say that it is a sunnah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam practiced on Raf'ul Yadayn. But we say that it is more preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. However, as I just mentioned, that if a person does do Raf'ul Yadayn in his namaz, in his prayers, then his prayer would not be considered invalid. His prayer would not be considered disliked or detestable in any way whatsoever. Now the Hanafi mazhab, and similarly the mazhab and the opinion of Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh, can be supported through a number of hadiths. The first hadith, which can be found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, narrated by Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Mas'ud radhiyallahu anhu. Once he says to the tabi'in, to the predecessors, that ala usalli bikum salat Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that shall I not demonstrate to you, shall I not show you the salah read by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam? That Sayyidina Abdullah bin Mas'ud is telling the tabi'in, the predecessors, that shall I not inform you and tell you how Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam read his salah. Upon which, فَصَلَّى Sayyidina Abdullah bin Mas'ud anhu, he read this salah. فَلَمْ يَرْفَعْ يَدَيْهِ إِلَّا فِي أَوَّلِ مَرَّةٍ, and he did not raise his hand besides for the takbir tahrima. Illa fi awwal marratin means that the beginning, when you do the takbir tahrima and he raises his hand, that's the only time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam raised his hand. And besides that, whilst going for ruku, whilst coming up from the ruku, whilst going for sajda, whilst coming up from the sajda, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not raise his hand. So that is the first hadith. The second hadith, which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud, also narrated by Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, and the wordings of the hadith is that Anna Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kana idha iftataha as-salah. That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he used to begin his salah, rafa'a yadayhi ila qaribin min udunay. He would raise his hand in line with his earlobes, indicating that for the takbir tahrim, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would raise his hand and his hand would be in line with his earlobes. Summa la ya'udu, and then after that he would not raise his hand. So again, this hadith of Sunan Abu Dawud quite clearly mentioning that the hand should be raised, or it was only raised by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the beginning, and then later on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not raise the hand. The third hadith, which can be found in Tabrani, is a hadith narrated by Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Abbas radiyallahu anhu, where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Turfa'ul aydi fi sab'i mawaqif." That in 7 places the hands will be raised. That in 7 places it is sunnah to raise your hand. And some example of those 7 places, like for example, when you ascend the Mount Safa and Marwa whilst doing Hajj, then as all of you know, those of you who've been for Hajj, it is considered sunnah that you should face towards the Ka'batullah, face towards the house of Allah, and then raise your hands for takbir. Similarly, whilst doing istilam meaning, like for example, if a person cannot kiss the black stone because there's too many people, then from far he can gesture the act of kissing, which is known as istilam, and whilst doing istilam he raises his hands for takbir. So there are 7 places generally where it is sunnah to raise your hand, and out of those 7 places Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stated fi istitahi salah, at the beginning of salah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't say in the ruku or wa in the raf'il ruku. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't say that whilst going for ruku it is sunnah to raise your hand, or whilst coming up from the ruku it's sunnah to raise your hand. But out of those 7 places where he said that it is sunnah to raise your hand, one of the 7 which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned was fi istitahi salah, at the beginning of the salah. And the 4th hadith, which can be found in Sunan al-Bayhaqi, narrated by Sayyiduna Abbad bin Zubair radiyallahu anhu, that the words of the hadith is that kana idha iftataha as-salah, that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is to begin his salah, rafa'a yadayhi fi awwal as-salah, that he will raise his hand at the beginning of the salah, thumma lam yarfa'huma fi shay'in hatta yafruga, that and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not raise his hands again until he finished his salah, hatta yafruga, ya hatta se wo farig ho gaya, meaning that until he finished his namaz and finished his salah. So these are 4 hadiths which indicate that, or which support the Hanafi opinion with regards to this particular masla, and that is that it is preferable and it is more virtuous not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. Now, as I mentioned above, that this difference is just based on preferability and non-preferability. Nothing to do with whether your namaz will become invalid or not. And the Hanafi scholars in their respective books have mentioned a few points why it is preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn, why it is preferable to omit Raf'ul Yadayn whilst going into the ruku and whilst coming up from the ruku. Now I'll just mention a few points. The first point is that the Hanafi scholars have written or have said that not to do Raf'ul Yadayn is more in accordance or is more in line with the verses of the Holy Quran. Now in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said or has described how you should read your namaz. He has said, وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, that stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with qunut, i.e. with khushu, with devotion. with concentration. That's how you should read your namaz. If you open your Fazail A'mal, you'll see many hadiths how the Sahabas, how the companions would read their namaz. They would read the namaz, they would be so still that the birds will assume that it's a tree, and the birds would come and sit on the shoulders of the Sahabas, would sit on the head of the Sahabas, assuming it to be a tree. That's how still they were whilst reading namaz. So this particular verse is saying that whilst reading namaz, you should be concentrating, you should have full devotion in your mind, in your heart, your limbs should be only towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As described in a previous hadith of Sahih al-Muslim, where when Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam came in a form of a person, and he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that inform me about ihsan, upon which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied by saying, "An ta'budallah ka'annaka tarah," that worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if as though you are watching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. And if that is not possible, then assume that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching over you, and read your namaz in that state and in that situation. So from the verse of the Holy Quran, وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, it's saying that while in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should be concentrating. You shouldn't be playing around with your clothes, with your beard or anything like that. You shouldn't be doing that. So from this verse, the Hanafi scholars have said that we can deduce that that namaz or that salah where there is less action, it is better than that namaz where there is more action. And obviously, Raf'ul Yadayn, you are adding two actions in each rakat, meaning that before you go for the ruku, you have to raise your hand. That is like an action, an extra action, whilst coming up from the ruku, while saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, you're raising your hand. So again, you're adding another action there. So from this particular verse, it's saying, or it's telling us that the less action in the namaz, that is more better. Why? Because that will enable us to get this devotion. Because obviously, you guys will know that the more, when you are proper, like, when you got no problems in your head or in your mind, you will concentrate more in the namaz than in a situation where you've got problems and you've got thoughts in your mind. Similarly, like when you're playing around with things and your clothes and your mobile phone and so on, you're far less likely to concentrate in your namaz. So from this particular verse, we can elaborate, or we can deduce that the less action in namaz, that is more better and that is more preferable. So from this we can substantiate that it is preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. Why? Because it increases extra actions in the namaz. So that is one point. The second point, which I mentioned before, is that wherever there is a hadith and there are contradictory hadith, like one hadith is saying this, one hadith is saying that, then we look at the practice of the companions. We look at the practice of the Sahaba, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, radiyallahu anhum wa radu an. We look at their practice and see what they did. I gave this example before, like in particular with combining of prayers. So there are contradictory hadiths. One hadith says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam combined his prayers. Other hadith says he didn't combine his prayers. So we looked at the action of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu anhu, and he has said that it is impermissible to combine your prayers, even to the extent that there's a hadith which has been narrated from him that whoever combines his prayers, then faqad ata baban bin abwab al-kaba'ir, he in fact has done a kabira guna, he has done a great sin. Similarly, I gave this example for the Bismillah as well, that in namaz should we read Bismillah loudly, should we say the Ameen loudly or quietly. So I gave that particular example that wherever there is a difference of opinion, then we look at the practice of the Sahaba. We see that, okay, what did the Sahabas do? Did they read the Bismillah loudly, or did they read it quietly? Or like Ameen, did they say it loudly or did they say it quietly? So exactly same thing here as well. This contradictory hadiths. Hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih al-Muslim is saying that Raf'ul Yadayn, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did Raf'ul Yadayn. Whereas the hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abu Dawud is saying that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do Raf'ul Yadayn. So we look at the practice of the Sahaba, and we come across hadiths, or you call them asar, sayings of the Sahaba, which can be found in Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba and in I'la Sunan, where it says that Sayyiduna Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu anhu, Sayyiduna Ali radiyallahu anhu, and Sayyiduna Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, and obviously as I mentioned, Sayyiduna Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, practice and amal was that they would not do Raf'ul Yadayn. That when they went for the ruku, they would not raise their hand. When they would come up from the ruku, they would not raise their hand. So from this we can understand that the second point is that where there are differences of opinion, we look at the practice of the Sahabas, we look at the practice of their predecessors, and we find, like Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, as I mentioned, that Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu is not like ordinary person. He's like the second Khalif of Islam, and he's known as al-Muhaddathun, meaning that verses of the Holy Quran were revealed in accordance of the desires or in accordance with the will of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu. Like verses of hijab was revealed because Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu wanted a ruling where the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam can be safeguarded from immoral people. Like the Maqam Ibrahim, he wanted that place to be considered as a musalla, as a place where people will read 2 rakat salah after they finish their tawaf, upon which the verse وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ was revealed. And obviously with regards to the prisoners of the Battle of Badr, what Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu wanted all the prisoners to be killed. So the verse was revealed of Surah At-Tawbah. So again, they were revealed because of the wish and desire of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu. So Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu's practice and amal was that he would not do Raf'ul Yadayn. So that is the second point. The third point, indicating that it is preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn, is that it was the practice of the people of Medina and the people of Kufa. Now Kufa is a city in Iraq. It was their practice not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. That in their namaz or in their salah, was going for ruku and was coming up from the ruku, they would not do Raf'ul Yadayn. Now you may be thinking that, Medina, Munawwara and Kufa, what speciality does it hold? It's like, for example, many of us, like from people from different countries, they will come to England, they will go to Oxford, they will go to Cambridge to study. Now why would they go to Oxford and Cambridge to study? Is because those two universities are the best universities in the whole world. That people from China, people from America, people from Australia will come to England to study at Cambridge, to study at Oxford. Why? Because these two places are the best universities in the whole world. And similarly, during the Tabi'in, during the predecessor time, the two great universities of Islamic knowledge was in Medina and in Kufa in Iraq. And many people from faraway lands would come to Medina Munawwara and to study with scholars such as Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh. People will go to Kufa and will study with scholars there as well. So the practice of the people of Medina and the practice of the people of Kufa was that they would not do Raf'ul Yadayn. Where traditional great shuyukh, great tabi'ins and predecessors and their predecessors were still alive in Kufa at that time, were still alive in Medina Munawwara at that time, and they were teaching the classical stuff from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then their practice would also be used to support our view, and their practice was that they would not do Raf'ul Yadayn, they would not raise their hand whilst going into the ruku and whilst coming up from the ruku. And the fourth point, which the Hanafi scholars have written, which indicates towards the preferability not to do Raf'ul Yadayn, to miss out Raf'ul Yadayn, is that when we look at the history of Salah, or the history of all the obligations or all the commands of Islam, we have seen that it has gradually changed. During Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, it gradually changed to the command which it is now. I'll give you an example. Take the example of alcohol. So the very first verse to be revealed with regards to alcohol is the verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. When the people were asking you, or you were asking Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with regards to alcohol, wal-maysir, and with regards to gambling. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ. That say to them, say to the companions, that there is some benefit in alcohol. There is some benefit in gambling. the alcohol, as you know, it can be used for like medical purposes and so on. So there is some benefit of alcohol. Even gambling, there is some benefit, like you bought a scratch card for £1 and you get £100. So there is some benefit. However, the disadvantages outweigh the benefits. The disadvantages of gambling, like it causes friction. You're taking somebody else's wealth, hard-earned wealth. It causes friction, it causes fights and so on. And similarly, the disadvantages of alcohol, that when you become drunk, then you start like saying things and you start breaking things and so on. So the disadvantages of alcohol, the disadvantages of gambling outweigh the benefits of gambling, outweigh the benefits of alcohol. So that was the very first verse to be revealed regarding alcohol. Now, in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't prohibit alcohol. He didn't say that alcohol is haram. He just made the Sahabas, the companions, aware that alcohol is something which is bad and you should stay away from it. And then the next verse to be revealed with regard to alcohol is the verse of Surah An-Nisa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la taqrabu salata wa antum sukara. That do not read your salah in the state when you are intoxicated. That in the intoxicant state, do not read your salah. So from the second verse, drinking alcohol during namaz time became prohibited. Outside namaz time, it was still permissible to still drink alcohol. However, just during namaz time, it became prohibited and it became unlawful to drink alcohol. And then the last verse to be revealed is the verse of Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا الْخَمْرُ وَالْمَيْسِرُ وَالْأَنصَابُ وَالْأَزْلَامُ. That verily alcohol, wal-maisir, gambling, wal-ansab, idol worshipping, wal-azlam, and divining arrows, rijsum min amali shaitan, they are all filth and they are all acts of the devil. فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. So that is the third verse to be revealed with regard to alcohol, prohibiting alcohol for ever and ever, all the way until the day of judgment. Similarly, when we look at other obligations such as Hajj, the Hajj isn't something which started during Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time. The obligation of Hajj started, or the essence can be traced back to Sayyiduna Ibrahim alayhi salam's time. And even during the days of ignorance, people would come, mushrik, disbelievers, they would come, they would do tawaf around the Kaaba naked. And they would go to Muzdalifah and all these places, they will camp there and they will talk about their ancestors, they will talk about their bravery, they will boast regarding the ancestors and so on. So when Islam came, it kept the ritual of Hajj. However, the other things, like the mushriks doing tawaf around the Ka'batullah, around the Baytullah naked, that became annulled, that became abrogated. And the verse was revealed that, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu innamal mushrikuna najasun فَلَا يَقْرَبُ الْمَسْجِدَ الْحَرَامِ. That the mushriks, they are impure and they are not allowed to come to Masjid al-Haram after this particular year. Now when we look at namaz, the history of namaz, we can see that at the very beginning of namaz, and this is I'll probably touch on later on, at the very beginning, it was permissible to talk in namaz. Many hadiths where the Sahaba, they would be reading namaz together and they would talk to each other in namaz. It was allowed to look around in namaz. You could, like, for example, look behind your back, nothing will happen. Your namaz will still be valid and your namaz will not be considered invalid. You could, like, give salam, you could reply to somebody's salam, you could say assalamu alaikum to someone and so on. You could do everything. You could talk, you could do everything. But then slowly, these actions became abrogated. Before it was permissible to talk in namaz, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam abrogated it. It was permissible to look around in namaz, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam abrogated it. So what we can see, or what we can say with regards to Raf'ul Yadayn, that we can say that this may have been the practice at the very beginning of Islam, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam may have done Raf'ul Yadayn, may have raised his hands whilst going into ruku and whilst coming up from the ruku. However, we say that later on, this action may have been left out by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We don't say it became abrogated, but we'll say that it is an action which was omitted by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these are the 4 points which I've mentioned, which the Hanafi scholars have said, which indicates that it is preferable not to do Raf'ul Yadayn. The second mas'ala which we're going to look at is with regards to where should you place your hands. Like after you've done the takbir al-tahrima, and you've placed your right hand over your left hand, then where should you place it? Where should you put it? Should you put it below your navel or should you put it above your navel? Now, firstly, Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi has said that it is more preferable to place your hand below your navel. So when you've done the takbir tahrima and you put your right hand over your left hand, then it is more preferable to place it below your navel. Imam Shafi rahmatullahi has got two views. There are two opinions from Imam Shafi rahmatullahi. One opinion of Imam Shafi rahmatullahi is that it is similar to the view of Imam Hanifa rahmatullahi, and that is that it should be placed below your navel. However, the most correct opinion narrated by Imam Shafi rahmatullahi, and that is that it should be placed above your navel and on your chest. Now, this particular masla is similar to Raf'ul Yadayn. That the difference between the differences between Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi and Imam Shafi rahmatullahi is based upon which of the two is the more virtuous. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi says that it is more virtuous and more preferable to place it below your navel. However, it's written in the Hanafi text as well that if a person happens to place his hand on his chest and above his navel, then there's no detestability in his namaz. His namaz will not be considered invalid or anything like that. Similarly, in the Shafi mazhab, they say that it is more preferable to place your hand on your chest above your navel. However, if a person who follows the Shafi mazhab, if he places his hand below the navel, then his namaz will not be considered invalid. His namaz will not be considered disliked in any way whatsoever. So the differences here is based upon which of the two is the more virtuous. Now, Imam Shafi rahmatullahi, whose view is that it is preferable to place your hand on your chest, they bring forward a couple of hadiths. The first hadith, which can be found in Sahih ibn Khuzaymah, narrated by Sayyiduna Wa'il bin Hujr radhiyallahu anhu. And the words of the hadith, or the hadith says that he saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam place his right hand over his left. Now he placed his right hand over his left, and then he placed it above his navel on his chest. So this is a hadith of Sahih ibn Khuzaymah, narrated by Sayyiduna Wa'il bin Hujr radhiyallahu anhu, indicating that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam placed his right hand on his left, and then he placed it above his navel and on his chest. And the second hadith, which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud, again similar meaning, in which narrated by Tawus, that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he placed his right hand on his left, he grasped it or clasped it firmly, and then he placed it on his chest. The Hanafi view, or the Hanafi opinion, can be supported through the following hadiths. The first hadith, again also narrated by Sayyiduna Wa'il bin Hujr radhiyallahu anhu, and this is a hadith which can be found in Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba. He says, Ra'aytu Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that I saw Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam yada'u yaminahu ala shimali. I saw Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam place his right hand or his right palm over his left. Yada'u yaminahu ala shimalihi tahta surra, below his navel. And the second hadith, which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud, narrated by Sayyidina Ali radhiyallahu anhu, and the words of the hadith is, Inna min as-sunnati wad'u al-kaffi ala al-kaffi fi as-salati tahta as-surra. That it is from the sunnah, it is of the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to place one palm over the other, wad'u al-kaffi ala al-kaff fi as-salah, in namaz, in salah, tahta as-surra, below the navel. So these are a couple of hadiths, as I say, supporting the Hanafi viewpoint, the Hanafi opinion that it is more preferable to place your hand below your navel, whereas the Imam Shafi rahmatullahi's view can be substantiated from the hadith of Sahih ibn Khuzaymah and of Sunan Abu Dawud. Now, as I mentioned before, that this particular issue is just got to do with which of the two is more preferable and more virtuous to do. Now, the Hanafi scholars have said that, or they just mentioned a point here, And that is that when you're standing in front of someone, then it is more preferable, or it is more like respect, or more respectful, that you stand and you place your hands below your navel. And this is substantiated from Imam Suyuti rahmatullah alayhi's Durr Mansur. Now Imam Suyuti rahmatullah has written that when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam was speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as all of you know, I mentioned this before, that Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam is known as Kalimullah, i.e. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, and even Musa alayhi salam spoke back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he is given the title of Kalimullah. Now Imam Suyuti rahmatullah has mentioned that when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, he placed his right hand over his left and he placed it below his navel. And from this particular hadith, the incident, we'll say, the scholars have deduced that a student or a disciple, when he's standing in front of his teacher, or when he's standing in front of his spiritual mentor, then it is an act of respect, or it is considered more respectful to stand in that particular way. And that's why you'll see that many people, many disciples, when they speak with their teachers and so on, you will see them that they will stand and their right hand will be over the left and they will place it below their navel. Why? Because it's considered more respectful like this. It's considered disrespectful to stand in front of a teacher with your hands in a pocket, or to stand like this, or your hands on your waist and so on. It's considered disrespectful. And because in namaz or in salah, we are in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the ever-knowing, who is the all-powerful, who is the Lord of the universe, then it is more preferable, or we say that it is more afdal and more preferable and more virtuous that you stand in that way as stood by Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, and that is that you place your right hand over your left and you place it below your navel. But as I said, this particular issue has got to do with what is virtuous and what is preferable to do and what is not preferable to do. Inshallah, the third issue with regards to index finger, we'll look at it next week. Before we finish, just one question which was sent by one of the brothers. It's with regards to the witr namaz during Ramadan. Now, there's a few questions here. The first situation, or the first question is that if a brother has missed his Isha namaz, like for example, Isha is around 9:30 or 9:45. So he's come around 10 o'clock, say he's missed his Isha namaz. So the question is that can he do the witr in congregation afterwards? After he's done the Taraweeh, can he read the witr in congregation afterwards? Now the masla is there's a couple of situations. The first situation is that did that brother read the Isha namaz or not? If that brother, he didn't read Isha namaz at all, like for example, he came at 10 o'clock, the Isha Jamaat had already finished, and he didn't go somewhere in the corner to read his Isha namaz by himself. He just went straight, just came straight to the mosque and started the Taraweeh Salah. He didn't read the Isha namaz at all. Now in that situation, he would not be allowed to participate in the witr namaz afterwards. The reason why is that witr becomes compulsory or wajib after you've read your Isha namaz. Witr isn't compulsory or wajib before Isha namaz. Okay, you read your Isha namaz first and then your witr starts. So if a brother, he's missed his Isha namaz with congregation and he didn't go to a classroom or he didn't go to the back and read his Isha namaz separately by himself, instead he just joined the Taraweeh congregation and he read the Taraweeh, and then after that the Imam is starting his witr namaz in congregation, then in that situation he will not be allowed to participate in the witr namaz. If he does participate, then he will have to repeat it again. Okay, so that is the first situation. The second situation is that if he's read the Isha namaz by himself separately, individually somewhere else. Like for example, he's come to the mosque, the Isha Salah has already finished, they've started the Taraweeh, but he goes to the back, he goes to the foyer, or he goes to the extension there, and he reads his Isha namaz by himself, and then he comes and he joins the Taraweeh Salah. Then in that situation, he would be allowed to read the witr namaz. Why? Because he has read his Isha namaz before. And the third question was with regards to if a person misses some rakats of Taraweeh. Like a person, he went to the toilet during Taraweeh namaz, he missed 2 rakats, he missed 4 rakats. So obviously he comes back and he's read he's finished the Taraweeh Salah, so he's only read 16 rakats, say for example. So the question is that without doing qaza of the remaining 4 rakats, would he be allowed to participate in the witr salah or in the witr in congregation? So the masla is that yes, he will be. Okay, so even though you missed a few rakats of Taraweeh, it doesn't matter. What you do is that you participate in the witr in congregation, and then after that do qaza of it after the witr finishes. And the third question, or the last question, was with regards to Taraweeh and fasting. There are some people, as I mentioned last week, that because of their ill health, they may have like severe diabetes and so on. So they are exempt from fasting. They cannot fast. So the question they ask is that because they're not going to fast tomorrow, is it necessary for them still to come to the mosque and read the Taraweeh Salah? Just because they're not going to fast tomorrow, they're ill or whatever, is it still sunnah muakkada? Is it still an emphasized sunnah for them to come to the mosque and read the Taraweeh Salah? So the masla of the ruling is that Taraweeh Salah and fasting, they're different, or they are two different things. It's not, Taraweeh Salah is not a prerequisite for fasting, that if you are going to fast, then you'll have to read the Taraweeh Salah. They're different. So even if a person is not fasting for some reason the following day because he's ill or because of some other reasons or the problems, then it is still sunnah muakkada, it is still the emphasized sunnah for him to still read the Taraweeh Salah the night before. So that is the masla, that Taraweeh and fasting, they're not linked with each other. So even if you're not fasting for some reason, it is still sunnah muakkada for him to read the Taraweeh Salah. The same way, like for example, if a person missed his Taraweeh Salah, let's say he was working and he couldn't read Taraweeh Salah, so it doesn't mean that he doesn't fast the next day. No, he still have to fast the next day, and he'll get a sin for missing the Taraweeh Salah. So he's exactly saying that Taraweeh and fasting, they're two different things. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq, like someone has been said, wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillah. Anybody has any questions?